10 best fantasy books of all time, according to me and what I have read so far. Which means this list is definitely lacking. I love watching these type of videos, but this was really hard to make because narrowing down 10 top books that I read is so hard for so many reasons, but one of them being I feel like I haven't read a lot of the big names in fantasy, so I'm probably missing important people that should be on this list simply because I haven't read them yet. But this is my list according to what I have read so far, and as I continue to read more fantasy books, I can make other videos updating this list and see if it has changed whenever I read other big names, if I actually like them. I'm also leaving off books from this list that I absolutely loved, and some of them are hard to leave off, but I decided that I'm definitely going to make it 10 books. But I will be giving this list in no particular order because trying to rank these books would be even harder. The first book that I'm going to talk about on this list is The Hobbit. This is one of the very first fantasy books that I ever read, and it definitely helped open my eyes up to fantasy. I did not start immediately reading a bunch of fantasy after this, but it did give me a glimpse into the genre and probably helped lead me along the way. I'm trying not to include multiple books from the same series on this list, so I only have The Hobbit on here and not Lord of the Rings, which kind of feels wrong. And this is one of the reasons that making a list like this will send me spiraling, because Lord of the Rings probably has like much deeper themes. It's definitely more grown up, serious, and just, oh my gosh, the depth of the world in Middle Earth, and then just the depth of the themes in Lord of the Rings is definitely more than you get in The Hobbit. And The Hobbit seems like a much lighter book in tone. And whenever I'm making lists like this, I almost lean towards like, if these are my top books that I'm holding up, I'm going to lean towards serious rather than fun and enjoyable, even if fun and enjoyable is what I tend to gravitate towards. And this is where I'm going like, how can I choose something fun over something more serious and that has like deeper themes? But the reason I chose The Hobbit is because of the impact it had on me. At the time that I was reading The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings for the first time, The Hobbit was much more my jam. The Hobbit and its lighter tone was what I was looking for in books. So I only read Lord of the Rings once, and it has been a lot of years since I've read Lord of the Rings. So if I reread them now, one of the Lord of the Rings books might make my top 10 list, but I feel like I have to reread them first, and just going on impact that these books had on me, The Hobbit is going to be the one that wins. How about you? What was one of the first fantasy books you read, and what book got you into fantasy? Was it the same book, or did you have to try multiple books? Personally, I did not start reading a bunch of fantasy after I read The Hobbit, and I did try reading multiple adult fantasy books, and none of them were really clicking with me until I read Assassin's Apprentice. And honestly, I credit Assassin's Apprentice for me enjoying adult fantasy books. Whenever I read Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb, I honestly thought that I was much more of a plot-driven reader at the time, and this book plus Becky Chambers' books, I read both of them around the same time, convinced me that I love character stories. And I almost DNF'd Assassin's Apprentice in the first half because I was like, nothing's really happening. But the second half of the book, I stayed up all night finishing Assassin's Apprentice because I became so attached to these characters and so engrossed in this story and this world that I just had to finish the book. And that's when I knew I do like adult fantasy. There is adult fantasy out there for me, and this is it. And not only that, I love character-driven stories and character studies. I've yet to read all of The Realm of the Elderling. I am taking my slow time through the entire series, but I have read all of the Farseer trilogy, and Fitz will always have a special place in my heart. Speaking of Becky Chambers though, the book that I read around the same time as Assassin's Apprentice was A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, but my favorite Becky Chambers book is Record of a Spaceborn Few. So I'm going to include that one on this list instead because this book just means so much to me. This is probably one of the books that I have reread the most. I've reread this book so many times, and this is a world that I want to live in. The Wayfarer's fleet is just so intriguing to me, and I wish I could be on this fleet along for the ride with these characters. One of the things that's really interesting about this book is it's basically a flawed utopia. A lot of the ways they live, they have to live in cooperation with each other in order to survive on this fleet. But there's still problems along the way. There's problems with communicating with other planets and other species. There's problems within the fleet itself with the communication between the characters and just different desires. I feel like this book has so many deep themes, but one of the biggest themes in this book is finding home and finding a place to belong. And I love books that have those themes, and I just am so attached to this world and to these characters and love seeing them go about their day to day. This list also has some recency bias on it because the majority of the books on this list are books that I read within this last year. The next book I'm going to mention is A Game of Thrones. So last year I watched the TV series for the very first time, and then I picked up the first 2 books in A Song of Ice and Fire series. I do intend to continue with these books, but I was surprised how much I liked this world. I avoided A Game of Thrones, both the TV series and the books, for so long because I was convinced that these were not books that I would enjoy. I mean, people argue about whether or not they're grimdark, but the fact that they could be grimdark adjacent or on the edge of grimdark was already a reason for me not to read these books. I did not like dark books. I did not like violent books. And I also heard a lot of things about these books as far as their treatment of female characters and particularly sexual assault on female characters throughout the books and this TV series. And I was just convinced that basically everything I had heard was things that made me not want to read these books and not watch the TV series. Thankfully, Rob and Hobb fans are the ones that convinced me that I should give A Game of Thrones a try, and I am so glad that I did. This is definitely one of my favorite series. Yes, they're violent. Yes, there's poor treatment of female characters throughout the world, but what surprised me the most, particularly in regards to female characters, is while the world of A Game of Thrones is patriarchal and maybe sometimes violent towards women, the writing of A Song of Ice and Fire is not that way. We have a lot of female agency. We have a very diverse cast of female characters with strengths in many different ways. And that was not something I had previously heard about when hearing about A Game of Thrones. And I fell in love with all of these characters. I mean, some of them I love and some of them I hate, but I am super attached to them, and I am so glad that I am reading this series for the first time and that I watched the TV series, and I plan on rewatching the TV series and rereading these books someday. I am so much enjoying it. And speaking of dark and violent books that I avoided The Poppy War for so long. But one of the book clubs I was in decided to read The Poppy War, and I thought, well, I'll go ahead and give it a try. And of course, I can always stop reading it if I don't like it. And I devoured this book. Whenever I was reading it, I couldn't put it down. I had to know what happened next. I have only read the first book so far. This is one of the books series that I am trying to finish this year. But The Poppy War book 1 so far is on my top 10 books that I have read. And maybe this is recency bias, but I just love this book so much. I also love getting to learn about the real life history that inspired this book. And I'm excited to dive into the rest of the books and continue to learn more about a time period in history that I was not as familiar with. On a lighter tone, but in kind of the same vein as his historical inspired fantasy, I also read The Adventures of Amina Al-Sirafi this year, and that is one of my favorite books. Again, maybe this is recency bias coming into play, but I suspect that I will reread this book multiple times. I had such a fun time with it. It is definitely character driven, particularly for the first half of the book, and the first half of the book all we're doing is getting the crew back together. This is about a retired pirate who basically gets conned into going out and pirating again, going on one last mission, and she decides to try to get her crew back together, some of which have decided to leave their life of piracy and live an honorable life, and some of which who are very ready to go along with her again. It was such a fun story. It definitely had a lot of humor, a lot of heart, and I love getting to see these characters as they go on their mission one last time. I also have a review of this one on my channel, which I will have linked in the description in case you're interested in seeing that. Getting away from recent books and moving back to a book that I read many years ago, but I still think about because of the impact it had on me, and that is A Monster Calls. This is a book that I only read because I saw a trailer for the movie and I went, that looks interesting. So I got the book out from the library and read it, and oh my gosh, read this book with a box of tissues beside you. It is one of those books. We are following a character whose mom is dying of cancer, and a monster shows up and talks to this character in the middle of the night and just tells him stories. And these stories help our main character process his grief and his anger and all of the emotions that he is feeling about his situation. It is beautiful and devastating, and I loved it. And the movie version is also just as beautiful and devastating. It is one of the best adaptations I have seen. It really captures the heart of the story and pretty much follows the story very closely. Another book on this list that is rumored to have a movie adaptation is His Majesty's Dragon. This is also one of the early adult fantasy books that I read, and one of the books again that made me realize that I like character-driven stories, because I was reading, I think, about book 4 or 5, and my significant other at the time asked me how I was enjoying the story, and I said, Lawrence and Temeraire in the story, of course I'm enjoying it. And he was like, yeah, but are you enjoying this particular book? And I'm like, it doesn't matter what's happening in the book because Lawrence and Temeraire are in it. I'm just enjoying seeing these two characters and seeing them explore the world together. His Majesty's Dragon is about a naval captain during the Napoleonic War who accidentally becomes a dragon rider, and because he is now a dragon rider, he has to join the Dragon Air Force, which is kind of the looked down upon side of the military in this world. No one really respects the aviators, and he basically has to go through this big adjustment and rediscover what his priorities are. His dragon, Temeraire, is also very precocious and just so curious about everything in the world, and really challenges Lawrence's notions about the world, because he will be like, okay, but why are we doing it this way? Why can't we do it the other way? And Lawrence is like, well, because it's always been done this way. This is just the proper way to do it. And the dragon's like, okay, well, I'm going to dismiss that and do it my own way. And basically the push and pull of these two characters as they force each other to see outside perspectives. Now, this does take place during the Napoleonic War, so we do have battles and dramatic things happening in these stories, but I do think they are ultimately character-focused stories, and I love them so much. I am rereading through them this year. I'm up through book 5, which I almost included book 5 on this list. Victory of Eagles is the one that I just finished, and it is one of the best Temeraire books aside from book 1. So I almost wanted to include it, but I decided not to include multiple books from the same series on this list. And I'm mostly talking about adult fantasy on this list, but I enjoy a good middle grade fantasy too. And I included Darkstalker on this list because I have enjoyed the Wings of Fire series, and Darkstalker is probably my favorite Wings of Fire book. I went into this book with low expectations because Darkstalker is one of our antagonists in the main series. He is the big bad guy in the second arc of the Wings of Fire. And this is like a spin-off book about Darkstalker whenever he was younger, how he became Darkstalker. And I was not really that interested in reading from Darkstalker's perspective. I didn't think I would enjoy that because he's not a likable character in the main books. But I loved this book. This was such a well-told corruption arc. We do get to see this book from multiple perspectives, both Darkstalker, Darkstalker's friend, and Darkstalker's sibling, and we get to see why he goes mad and wants to destroy the world. I think you could pick up this book as your entry into Wings of Fire, or just to see if you would like any of the Wings of Fire books. It does work decently well as a standalone. This book is ultimately a tragedy, and it makes me think that I would like tragedies. Like, I really think I would, not only because of this book, but also Arcane is one of my favorite TV series, and season 1 is very much a tragedy. And I have not actually read that many books that are tragedies. So if you have any recommendations for me, particularly if they're in the fantasy genre, but even if they aren't, just like what is your favorite tragedy? And maybe I'll try it and see if this is actually a genre I like, or if I just happen to like a handful of these, like this might be a one-off thing. And the last book I'm including on this list, this is the big number 10 or the big number 1, whichever you want to call it. This book is Mad Ship. So I know that I said I was trying not to include multiple books in the same series on this list, but Mad Ship is part of Life Ship Traders, and Assassin's Apprentice is part of the Farseer trilogy. So they're basically different series, even if they are under the wider Realm of the Elderling series. The reason I'm including Mad Ship is because I seriously believe it is one of the best fantasy books ever. Both whenever I was reading the first book, Ship of Magic, and especially while I was reading Mad Ship, I was going, oh my gosh, I am reading one of the best books of all time. How can I top this? How can I go on and continue to read more fantasy books? This takes them all. And I'm reading the pinnacle of fantasy way too soon in my fantasy journey. How can any of them live up to this? How can any of them compare to this? Thankfully, I have been able to go on and enjoy other fantasy books, but these books are definitely among the best that I've ever read, and I look forward to continuing the Realm of the Elderling someday. I'm currently dedicated to reading The Wheel of Time first, and that is a big commitment of a series, so I'm going to read that big series before I get back into Realm of the Elderlings. But after I finish Wheel of Time, I do plan on going back to Realm of the Elderling and finishing that big series as well, because I am so excited to read more of Robin Hobb's world and her characters, and just, they're some of the best books I've ever read, and I don't know how to describe perfection. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of these, if you enjoyed them, or if you think I'm completely wrong to include them in a top 10 list. If I read other books in the future that become top 10 books, I will be remaking this video to include those books. Who knows, maybe Wheel of Time will make it in there. I haven't finished the books yet, so I don't know that yet. But just let me know, what are some of your favorite fantasy books, or just favorite books in general, in the comments. I look forward to chatting with you, and I hope to see you in another video. Happy reading!